Welcome to Fluent Daily, the English listening channel for advanced learners at B2 and C1 level. Every episode features a rich, flowing conversation in natural English on a topic that is genuinely worth thinking about: history, psychology, science, philosophy, and more. There are no simplified sentences here, no slow speech, no vocabulary drills. Just real English spoken naturally on ideas that matter. This is Fluent Daily. Let's get into it.
Today we have a great story, so let's get started right now.
So if you're a woman listening to this right now, maybe you're driving a car you own, or you're heading to a job where you keep your own paycheck, or, just managing a bank account that only has your name on it.
Right, just normal, everyday stuff.
Exactly. But consider this. A little over a century and a half ago, under the eyes of the law, in much of the Western world, you wouldn't just be denied those things. You would legally be considered the property of your husband or your father.
Which is just wild to really internalize.
It is, because when we wake up in the morning, our reality feels entirely fixed. Like gravity, We just assume the basic architecture of our lives, our rights, our civic existence is just a natural given. It's the solid floor we walk on. So how did we get from being legal property to possessing the fundamental right to self-determination?
Well, we got there through friction. We don't really question the floor we walk on, but the floor you just described is entirely synthetic. It was constructed. The simple acts of, owning property, going into college, keeping your own wages, or even having the legal right to say no to sex within a marriage, those are not natural givens. They are incredibly recent, highly specific achievements. And they were fought for bitterly over the course of nearly 2 centuries against sustained institutional opposition.
Which brings us to the mission for today's deep dive. Okay, let's unpack this. We are unpacking the single most sweeping, consequential social movement of the past 2 centuries, which is feminism.
Yeah.
The goal here is to explore how this movement fundamentally rewired the institutional structure of contemporary society. And we have a rich stack of historical excerpts and sociological analyses today. We're going to look at the historical battles, the heavy academic theory, the hard empirical data, and the culture shifts to understand how the world you live in was built.
But, before we start mapping all that out, there's a foundational trap we really have to avoid here.
Oh, what's that?
Framing feminism as a single movement is historically inaccurate. Treating it as this monolith actually erases the actual engine of the movement. Feminism is much better understood as a deeply fractured, highly argumentative family of movement.
A family of movements.
Right, because, yes, they share a broad, overarching concern for advocating for the equal rights and dignity of women. But historically, this family has been divided by fundamental disagreements over what equality actually means, how inequality operates mechanically, and what strategies are acceptable to dismantle it.
Wait, so is calling it a family of movements just a polite way of saying the movement was incredibly fractured and, couldn't agree on its own basic goals?
It is a way of acknowledging that the internal drama isn't just a footnote to the history, it is the main text.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, the internal clashes, especially over how gender inequality intersects with other systems of power, like race, class, and colonialism, those are the catalysts that force the movement to evolve. If you want to understand what the movement has accomplished, where it completely failed, and why we are having the specific cultural debates we're having today, you have to look at those fractures just as closely as the unified victories.
That makes a lot of sense. So we are going to use the famous metaphor of waves to structure this history today. First wave, second wave, third, fourth. But let's be honest about this framework.
Yeah, it's not perfect.
Right, nobody woke up in 1991, looked at the calendar and said, "Welcome to the third wave, everyone. Please update your activist brochures."
Exactly. The wave metaphor is, it's a retrospective, pedagogical oversimplification. History just doesn't happen in neat little boxes where one era cleanly ends on a Tuesday and the next begins on a Wednesday. The waves impose an artificial coherence. Every single wave possesses massive continuity with the ones that came before it, and every wave contains far more internal diversity than a single label can capture. But, and this is a major caveat, the wave framework provides a really workable, logical roadmap for tracking the evolution of these ideas over time.
And since we're using that roadmap, we have to start where the first major institutional challenges began, which is the first wave, the fight for the vote. Now, when we think of this era, The dates usually thrown around are 1848 through to around 1920.
Yeah, that's the standard timeline.
With 1848 being the Seneca Falls Convention in the U.S., where Elizabeth Cady Stanton helped organize the Declaration of Sentiments.
And that document was just a brilliant rhetorical ambush.
Ambush? How so?
Well, they literally took the American Declaration of Independence, the sacred text of the country that explicitly stated all men are created equal, and they essentially updated the source code. They asserted that all men and women are created equal.
Oh, wow. Right in their faces.
Exactly. It was designed to force the culture to look at its own stated democratic values and confront its glaring hypocrisy. But, you know, the intellectual foundations of this first wave actually reach back much further than Seneca Falls. To really understand the philosophy, we have to dial back to 1792 and look at Mary Wollstonecraft's publication, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman.
Okay, 1792.
Yeah, this is widely considered the first systematic feminist philosophical argument.
Which puts us right in the thick of the Enlightenment, the era of reason, the French Revolution, the birth of modern democracy. So we have all these philosophers writing grand treatises about liberty and the rights of man while simultaneously carving out a massive biological exception for women.
Yeah. In his framework, any apparent intellectual inferiority in women wasn't a lack of education. It was a natural incapacity. It was simply biology.
So the argument was basically, you aren't built for the public sphere, so just stay in the parlor.
Exactly. And Wollstonecraft argued something revolutionary against that. She argued that women only appeared to lack reason because they were actively, systematically deprived of education.
Right.
If you deny half the population access to rational education, of course they won't be able to participate in civic life to the same degree. Her argument was classically liberal.
Okay, hold on. We need to clarify classically liberal here. Because a modern listener hears liberal and immediately thinks of contemporary left-wing politics. And I'm guessing that's not what she was doing in 1792.
Right. Thank you. That is a really crucial distinction. In the context of 18th century philosophy, classical liberalism is about individual rights, rationality, and equality before the law.
Yeah.
Wollstonecraft was simply claiming that women possess the exact same innate capacity for reason as men. Therefore, under the rules of Enlightenment philosophy itself, women are entitled to the same civic participation, the same education, and the same fundamental rights that these male philosophers were demanding for themselves.
So it's basically an engineering argument. You cannot blame a machine for failing to operate if you refuse to supply it with a power source. And education is the power source.
That's a great way to put it.
But taking that elegant Enlightenment philosophy and turning it into actual voting rights on the ground was incredibly violent. And this brings us to those strategic fractures you mentioned earlier.
Yes.
Let's look at the United Kingdom suffrage movement.
Yeah.
Because the drama there is intense, and it completely shatters the image of women just politely asking for the ballot.
Oh, absolutely. The UK suffrage movement split into two deeply opposed factions over the mechanics of how to actually achieve political change.
Okay, who are the factions?
On one side, you had Millicent Fawcett leading the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. They were the constitutional suffragists. Their strategy was peaceful lobbying, writing letters, holding polite meetings, basically playing by the rules of the establishment.
And on the other side?
On the other side, you had Emmeline Pankhurst and the Women's Social and Political Union, the suffragettes, and they were militant.
Right, and I want to be specific here because militant can mean a lot of things. We aren't just talking about holding provocative signs or marching loudly, are we?
No, we are talking about a highly organized, sustained campaign of confrontational direct action and severe property destruction.
Wow.
They intentionally smashed store windows in central London. They set fire to empty buildings and mailboxes. They chained themselves to railings outside Parliament. They engaged in physical altercations with the police.
Wait, so they were breaking windows and going on hunger strikes. Was this level of severe civil disobedience seen as helping or hurting the cause at the time? Because this sounds exactly like the strategic schisms we see in modern social movements today.
It really is.
Do you play nice and try to win over the moderates, or do you break things until the establishment is forced to listen?
And that was the exact debate tearing the movement apart back then. The constitutionalists, like Fawcett, were horrified by this. They believed the militants were alienating the public and essentially proving the patriarchal argument that women were too emotional, too volatile, and too irrational to be trusted with the solemn duty of voting.
I see. They felt the militants were giving the state the exact excuse it needed to dismiss them entirely.
Exactly. While the militants, led by Pankhurst, countered that polite asking had achieved absolutely nothing for decades.
Which, fair point.
Right. Their argument was that political establishments only respond to pressure and that only the disruption of daily economic and social life would force the government's hand. And, the personal cost these militant women paid was staggering. The suffragette campaign of the 1910s remains one of the most dramatic campaigns of civil disobedience in British history. Over 1,000 women were imprisoned.
And instead of just mentioning they went to prison, let's talk about what actually happened inside those prisons. Because they didn't just sit in cells reading books, did they?
No, they didn't. They weaponized their own bodies.
Through hunger strikes.
Right. When in prison, the suffragettes demanded to be treated as political prisoners rather than common criminals. When the government refused, the women went on hunger strikes. They were entirely willing to starve themselves to death to force a political crisis.
That is intense dedication.
And the British state's response to this was viscerally brutal. They authorized force feeding. Prison guards and doctors would hold these women down, pry their mouths open with steel gags, and force rubber tubes down their throats or up their noses to pump liquid food into their stomach.
Oh, that sounds horrific.
It was. It was a violent physical suppression of a political demand.
And when the public outcry over force feeding got too loud, the government passed the Prisoners Act in 1913, which was widely known as the Cat and Mouse Act.
Yes.
And the cruelty of this mechanism is just astounding. The authorities would wait until a hunger-striking woman was dangerously close to death, release her just long enough for her to recover her health, and then immediately arrest her again to serve the rest of her sentence, like a cat playing with a mouse.
It really highlights the extreme physical reality of this fight. Through all this unimaginable sacrifice, both in the UK and the US, they eventually forced the issue.
Right.
The UK passes limited suffrage in 1918, and the US passes the 19th Amendment in 1920, but even in the glow of this massive victory, we have to examine the movement's defining blind spot.
Yeah, let's get into that. Because the movement was predominantly white and middle class, and that wasn't an accident, right? It was often a deliberate strategic choice.
It was heavily deliberate. The first wave's focus was concentrated almost entirely on formal legal equality. The vote, property rights, access to the professions. And to be fair, these were genuine, world-changing gains.
Absolutely.
But the relationship between the mainstream white-led suffrage movement and the simultaneous movements for Black civil rights and working-class labor rights was frequently one of active strategic exclusion.
Give me a concrete example of that exclusion. What did that actually look like?
Well, in the United States following the Civil War, there was a fierce debate over the 15th Amendment, which granted voting rights to Black men, but not to women. White suffrage leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were outraged by this.
Okay.
And in their fury, they frequently resorted to deeply racist rhetoric. They argued that educated white women were more deserving of the vote than formerly enslaved Black men.
Wow.
And later, to appease Southern politicians and secure support for the 19th Amendment, white suffrage organizations actively marginalized Black suffragists like Ida B. Wells, literally forcing them to march at the back of parades.
That's awful.
The specific narrow scope of their advocacy meant that deep racial and class tensions were baked into the institutional DNA of the movement from the very beginning.
Which sets up a really fascinating historical transition, because the massive irony of the first wave is that winning the right to vote eventually exposed the severe limitations of the vote.
Right.
Once you achieve that formal legal equality, a harsh reality sets in. Having the ballot doesn't actually fix the suffocating realities of daily life. You can vote for a senator, but you still can't get a credit card without your husband's signature.
Exactly.
Or you might be completely trapped in a domestic role that is psychologically crushing you.
The realization was that the law just isn't enough. Formal equality at the ballot box did not equate to lived equality in the home. The first wave dismantled the legal barriers in the public sphere, but the private sphere remained essentially a dictatorship.
And this realization caused a massive pivot.
It did. The movement shifted its gaze from the Capitol building to the living room.
Which brings us to the second wave, roughly spanning the 1960s through the early 1980s. And this entire era is defined by a single slogan, coined by Carol Hanisch in 1969. The personal is political.
And the personal is political is arguably one of the most profound theoretical insights of the 20th century.
Really? How so?
Well, before this, things like marriage dynamics, who does the dishes, reproduction, bodily autonomy, and sexuality, they were considered strictly private matters. They were seen as natural givens, entirely outside the scope of political intervention or legal scrutiny. Hanisch and the second wave argued that these private conditions were actually products of systemic power.
Okay, I want to understand the mechanism of how they actually figured this out. Because it wasn't just academics writing papers in ivory towers. It was a grassroots mechanism called consciousness-raising groups.
Yes. Consciousness raising was the operational engine of the second wave. Women would gather in living rooms, church basements, community centers, just sitting in circles talking about their lives.
Just talking.
Just talking. A woman might share that she feels incredibly isolated in her marriage, or that her husband controls all the finances, or that she experiences harassment at work. And previously, she would have thought, this is my personal failure. This is just my individual bad luck.
Right. I'm doing something wrong.
Exactly. But by sitting in a room with 10 other women who are describing the exact same experiences, the individual failure suddenly reveals itself as a structural design.
It's that moment you realize you aren't crazy, you're just trapped in the same cage as everyone else.
Perfectly said.
The sources highlight two foundational texts that provided the vocabulary for this realization. Let's look at Betty Friedan first. She published The Feminine Mystique in 1963, and she diagnosed something she famously called the problem that has no name. What was that?
Friedan captured a very specific post-war phenomenon in the United States. Following World War II, society was aggressively telling educated middle-class women that their ultimate fulfillment should be found entirely in domesticity.
The nuclear family dream.
Right. The ideal was a clean suburban house, a successful husband, and well-behaved children. The culture saturated them with the message that this was the pinnacle of female achievement. Yet legions of these women were experiencing a profound existential dread. They were going to psychiatrists, taking tranquilizers, and experiencing a deep, unexplainable emptiness.
Friedan essentially interviewed these women and found they were all asking themselves some version of, is this all?
Yes, exactly.
Like, I have the house, I have the kids, I have the appliances. Why do I feel like I'm suffocating?
And by giving this nameless problem a vocabulary, she catalyzed a massive awakening. She argued that the feminine mystique was a culturally constructed illusion. It stunted women's intellectual and personal growth by confining them to the role of glorified housekeepers.
But just like the first wave, Friedan's lens had severe limitations, didn't it?
Very severe. Subsequent feminist thinkers pointed out that Friedan's analysis was directed almost entirely at college-educated middle-class white women in the suburbs. It treated race and class as entirely peripheral. Many working-class women and women of color were already working outside the home, often as domestic laborers in the very suburban homes Friedan was writing about. For them, the right to join the workforce wasn't a novel liberation, it was an economic necessity.
That makes total sense. Now, the other foundational text the sources highlight actually predates Friedan by over a decade, but it became the philosophical bedrock of the second wave. Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, published in France in 1949.
Yes.
She provides what might be the most famous quote in feminist philosophy. One is not born, but rather becomes a woman.
It's an iconic line. De Beauvoir was applying existentialist philosophy to gender.
Okay, unpack that for us.
Existentialism, at its core, argues that existence precedes essence, meaning there is no fixed inherent human nature. We create our own essence through our actions and choices. De Beauvoir took this framework and applied it to femininity. What she proposed is that femininity is not a natural biological given, it is a social construction.
Okay, this is a heavy concept. Break down what it means to become a woman in this context. How does that actually happen mechanically?
It means that a person is born with female biology, but the role of woman, the behaviors, the expectations of submissiveness, the hyper-focus on physical appearance, the orientation toward caring for others at the expense of oneself, that role is produced through relentless systems of expectation, education, and socialization.
Ah, I see.
Society shapes girls into women in very specific ways. De Beauvoir used the concepts of immanence and transcendence.
Okay, what do those mean?
Men are encouraged toward transcendence, reaching outward, acting upon the world, creating, building. Women are forced into immanence, turning inward, remaining static, being acted upon. Society creates the woman, and de Beauvoir argued it creates her specifically to serve as the other to the male default.
If gender is a social construction rather than biological destiny, how did that theoretical idea actually translate into real-world legislation? Because it's one thing to have a philosophical breakthrough in a Parisian cafe, but it's another to change the laws of the United States government.
Well, The realization that these inequalities were socially constructed meant they were not acts of God or biology.
Right.
They were laws and customs made by men, which meant they could be dismantled by women. And this era produced staggering legislative achievements. Women sued, they lobbied, they organized massive strikes like the Women's Strike for Equality in 1970.
What were some of the big wins?
We see the passage of Title IX, which completely revolutionized women's access to higher education and athletics by tying federal funding to gender equity. We said the Equal Pay Act, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act.
But the legislative shift that reveals the true power of the personal is political is the criminalization of marital rape.
Yes.
It is chilling to think that before the second wave, marital rape wasn't legally recognized as a crime. Let's look at the mechanics of why that was.
The legal framework was based on a 17th century doctrine established by the English jurist Sir Matthew Hale. The doctrine essentially stated that by entering into the marriage contract, a woman gave irrevocable consent to sexual intercourse with her husband for the rest of her life.
Wow, forever.
Yes, she surrendered her bodily autonomy at the altar. The law legally could not conceptualize a husband raping his wife because she was technically his property and had pre-consented forever.
So the second wave had to fight state by state to legally establish that a woman's bodily autonomy supersedes a marriage license.
Exactly.
That is a fundamental rewiring of institutional logic. But as the movement gained these massive victories, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it also began to fracture intensely again. The idea of a unified sisterhood really broke down. What were the main camps here?
The divisions were deep and they were ideological. Broadly, you had liberal feminism, which focused on gaining equal access to existing structures and institutions.
Like getting more women into corporate boardrooms.
Right. Corporate boardrooms, government, the military. Then you had radical feminism, which argued that those existing structures were fundamentally patriarchal. They didn't want to integrate the boardroom. They wanted to burn the boardroom down and build a new system entirely.
Okay, quite a difference.
And you also had socialist feminism, which argued that gender oppression was inextricable from capitalist class exploitation.
And most critically for the future of the movement, you had a growing, powerful critique emerging from women of color.
Yes, absolutely. Black feminists, Chicana feminists, and indigenous feminists explicitly identified the race blindness of the predominantly white second-wave mainstream.
Right, going back to the Frieden critique.
Exactly. They pointed out that a movement prioritizing the right to work in a corporate office was fundamentally disconnected from the realities of women who were fighting against poverty, systemic racism, and state violence.
And those specific critiques from women of color didn't just fade away into academic footnotes. They became the entire intellectual bedrock of the third wave in the early 1990s.
They did.
The transition here is crucial. The third wave is best understood not as a rejection of the second wave, but as a necessary evolution to address its massive blind spots. And the defining concept of this entire era is intersectionality.
Intersectionality is the lens through which modern feminism operates. The term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a brilliant legal scholar, in 1989.
Okay.
She introduced it to describe a very specific mechanical problem in the law. She observed the way that race, gender, class, and other identity dimensions do not just exist side by side on parallel tracks. They interact, they overlap, and they overlap in ways that produce completely unique forms of discrimination.
I want to make sure we nail the mechanics of this because it's a huge conceptual breakthrough. Crenshaw wasn't just talking abstract sociology here. She identified a specific legal void. Let's use an analogy. Imagine the law as a Venn diagram. You have one circle containing laws that protect women from gender discrimination. You have another circle containing laws that protect black people from racial discrimination. The logic implies that if you are a black woman, you stand in the overlapping middle and get double the protection. But Crenshaw found the exact opposite was happening, right?
Precisely. In the overlap, the legal protections actually canceled each other out. Crenshaw based her theory heavily on a specific 1976 legal case, DeGraff and Reed v. General Motors.
What happened in that case?
General Motors was laying off workers based on a seniority system, last hired, first fired. Black women sued, arguing that because General Motors had historically refused to hire black women until very recently, the seniority system disproportionately targeted them.
And how did the court respond?
The court looked at the company and said, well, General Motors hires white women, so they aren't discriminating based on gender, and they hire black men in the factories, so they aren't discriminating based on race.
You've got to be kidding me.
Nope. The court essentially told the plaintiffs they had to choose to sue either as women or as Black people. The legal framework implicitly assumed that the baseline experience of woman was white and the baseline experience of Black was male. The compounded overlapping discrimination that a Black woman faced was literally invisible to the law.
Wow. So intersectionality became the legal and theoretical tool to finally see those invisible forms of discrimination.
Exactly.
But what also fascinates me about the third wave is the intense cultural and stylistic pivot. We move out of the 1970s living room and into the 1990s underground. Suddenly, we aren't just reading dense legal treatises. We get the Riot Girl movement.
Oh, yeah, huge shift.
We get punk bands like Bikini Kill, led by Kathleen Hanna. We get physical, handmade zines like Bustin' Bitch circulating the underground.
The third wave engaged directly with culture, media, and aesthetics in ways the second wave had often rejected. The second wave often viewed things like makeup, high heels, and traditionally feminine presentation as tools of patriarchal oppression to be discarded.
Right. Burn the bras, ditch the makeup.
Exactly. But the third wave generation pushed back against that rigidity.
It feels like a massive cultural remix. The third wave was aggressively reclaiming previously stigmatized aspects of femininity. You could wear bright pink lipstick, dress in a baby-all dress, scream punk rock lyrics about sexual assault, and read feminist theory all at the same time.
Yes.
They were embracing irony and contradiction. It was a total rejection of the idea that you had to have a perfect feminist resume or fit a rigid prescriptive mold to be politically legitimate.
But we need to ask how punk rock and zines functioned as actual political mechanisms. This stylistic shift reflected a genuine philosophical alignment with what academics call post-structuralist theory.
Okay, hold on. Post-structuralist theory is a heavy, dense academic term. What does that actually mean for a 1990s punk rocker making a zine in her bedroom? Connect those dots for me.
Right, let's break it down. Post-structuralism, heavily influenced by philosophers like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, is about dismantling grand, overarching narratives and focusing on how language and power construct our reality. In the context of feminism, heavily championed by theorists like Judith Butler, it meant arguing that gender isn't just a social construct you are forced into. It is a performance. It's something you do rather than something you are.
Oh, interesting.
For a riot girl making a zine, this translated into the idea that manipulating culture, reclaiming slurs like slut or bitch to drain them of their power, and aggressively performing gender on your own terms were highly effective acts of political subversion.
The cultural aesthetic was the political theory in action.
Exactly. But this also led to intense internal debates. The third wave was constantly navigating the tension between individual expression and structural critique.
In what way?
Well, critics argued that the third wave was too focused on how individuals personally presented themselves to the world and lost sight of dismantling the hard material inequalities of economics and law that the second wave fought for.
Which naturally brings us to how those highly individualized grassroots voices suddenly acquired a global megaphone. Because the transition from the third to the fourth wave is fundamentally driven by the architecture of the internet.
Absolutely.
The third wave individualized the feminist experience, but it took the technological explosion of the 2010s to network those individual experiences globally, turning them into a massive mechanism for structural accountability.
The fourth wave emerges around 2012 and is absolutely supercharged by the hashtag #MeToo movement in 2017.
Though it's vital to note the phrase Me Too actually originated with activist Tarana Burke in 2006, working with survivors of sexual violence in marginalized communities.
Yes, that context is essential.
But it was the 2017 social media explosion following the revelations about Harvey Weinstein that gave it unprecedented global reach. What fundamentally defines this fourth wave?
The defining mechanism is the use of social media as an organizing platform to circumvent traditional institutional gatekeepers. It brought a renewed, intense focus on sexual harassment and assault, framing them not as isolated, unfortunate events, but as deeply systemic, culturally embedded problems.
And the speed of it was staggering. Let's look at the mechanics of why it worked so fast. Because before social media, powerful men in media, politics, finance, and academia were protected by institutional protection rackets.
Oh, completely shielded.
You had human resources departments designed to protect the company, not the victim. You had the weaponization of NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, legally terrifying victims into silence. The press would often kill stories just to maintain access to power.
But social media bypassed all of those filters. A single tweet could coordinate thousands of women instantly. It shattered the isolation that abuse relies on. Within a single year, hundreds of powerful men who had previously operated with total impunity were suddenly facing rapid public accountability. It forced a cultural reckoning with the sheer scale of the problem.
But, as with every previous ways, this era is characterized by intense, ongoing internal debates. Let's look at those debates impartially, because they represent the current frontier of the movement's evolution.
The debates within the fourth wave are profound and deeply contested. First, there is a massive internal debate about due process in the digital square.
Right.
When accountability bypasses the legal system and happens on social media, what are the evidentiary standards? How does a movement balance the absolute necessity of believing survivors with the risks of rapid public judgment without formal adjudication?
Right. And there's the debate over the scope of the framework. Are we just addressing the symptoms? Like, by focusing on taking down individual bad actors, firing a CEO, canceling director, are we actually curing the disease of the systemic conditions that allowed them to thrive in the first place? Or is it just a very visible game of whack-a-mole that leaves the underlying power structures completely intact?
Exactly. Is it producing structural change or just individual catharsis? That is a very live debate. And finally, perhaps the most painful and publicly contested internal debate of the fourth wave involves the boundaries of feminist solidarity itself, specifically regarding trans inclusion.
Yeah.
The debates over how and whether trans women are included in the definition of woman for the purposes of feminist advocacy have fractured parts of the movement. These debates touch on fundamental questions about biological essentialism versus gender identity, and they are being argued fiercely within the movement's own ranks.
So we have spent a lot of time on history and theory. We have all these waves, all these academic concepts, and all these hashtags. But it is vital to ask, what has actually changed in the physical world? Let's step out of the theory and look at the empirical record, the hard data.
Let's do it.
Where have we actually achieved equality, and where is the architecture still broken?
The achievements of the feminist project over the last 2 centuries are empirically accessible, and the data tells a complex story of dramatic, undeniable progress in some areas and incredibly stubborn, persistent inequality in others.
Let's start with the hard wins, electoral representation.
It has improved dramatically globally. Countries like Sweden, Iceland, and New Zealand have either achieved or are rapidly approaching gender parity in their national legislatures.
Although the U.S. still lags substantially behind parity. But when you look at education, the shift is absolute. Women now comprise the majority of university graduates in most developed nations. We are seeing near parity in many traditionally male-dominated professions like medicine and law. The educational power source that Mary Wollstonecraft demanded in 1792 has largely been secured.
But then we have to confront the most heavily scrutinized metric in the entire feminist data set, the gender pay gap.
This is fiercely debated. The standard statistic we hear constantly in the U.S. and the U.K. is the unadjusted pay gap. Women make approximately 80 to 85 cents for every dollar a man makes working full-time.
We need to dissect the exact variables economists use to measure this, because that 80-cent figure is a broad aggregate. It simply compares the median earnings of all women working full-time to all men working full-time.
Right.
The picture becomes vastly more complicated when researchers adjust the data to control for specific variables. When economists control for specific occupations, hours worked, and years of continuous experience, that 20-cent gap shrinks significantly, often to around 5 to 7 cents.
Which immediately leads critics to say, see, the gap is just a myth. It's just the result of women making different occupational choices. They choose to go into teaching instead of petroleum engineering, and they choose to work fewer hours.
And that is where the debate genuinely lives. There is deep empirical disagreement among economists and sociologists about how to interpret that remaining gap and how to interpret the choices themselves. For instance, Claudia Goldin, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, points to the concept of greedy work.
Greedy work.
Yes. Many high-paying professions demand unpredictable, exorbitant hours. Because women still shoulder the vast majority of unpaid domestic labor and childcare, they are structurally penalized in these greedy professions.
So the debate is, are those occupational and scheduling choices truly free? Or are they severely constrained by societal expectations and an uneven distribution of labor at home?
Exactly.
If society expects the mother to leave work early when the kid gets sick, her career takes the financial hit. The data provides the numbers, But interpreting the cause of the numbers, whether it is direct employer discrimination or structural societal constraints, remains highly contested.
Precisely. But there is another set of data points that is much less ambiguous and significantly darker. What is deeply troubling is the persistent gap between legal reality and lived reality. When we look at the dimensions of inequality that the second and fourth waves focused on most intensively intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and harassment, the numbers remain staggeringly high globally.
This is the cognitive dissonance of the modern era. You can have a society where women outnumber men in university, where they are protected by laws like Title IX, where they run major corporations, but their physical safety in their own homes or walking down the street hasn't improved at anywhere near the same rate. Formal legal equality did not magically translate into bodily safety.
That is the central, ongoing tension of the movement today. The legal architecture has changed, but the embodied reality of violence and coercion proves far more resistant to change.
Now, almost all the history and data we just discussed centers on the developed Western world. And that leads us directly to one of the most powerful and necessary critiques of the mainstream feminist movement as a whole, which is its immense Western bias.
Yes. For the first three waves, the mainstream academic and theoretical conversation was predominantly Western, predominantly white, and largely secular.
Right.
Over the last few decades, feminist scholars and activists from the global South have forcefully challenged the export of this specific framework.
It's as if Western academia acted as a colonial export business. They wrote this massive one-size-fits-all feminist instruction manual based on the socioeconomic realities of life in New York or London, and then tried to ship it to countries with completely different histories, religions, and communal structures, expecting them to just assemble it like IKEA furniture.
The seminal text that articulated this critique was published in 1984 by Chandra Mohanty, titled Under Western Eyes. Mohanty fiercely criticized Western feminist scholarship for committing what she called epistemic imperialism.
Epistemic imperialism. Let's define that clearly. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. So she is saying the West is forcing its specific way of knowing and analyzing the world onto everyone else.
Precisely. She argued that Western academics were creating a monolithic stereotype in their literature, which she termed the third world woman.
Okay, what did that stereotype look like?
In Western feminist texts, this fictional composite woman was portrayed as uniformly oppressed, uniformly traditional, uniformly victimized by her culture, and entirely passive.
While the Western woman was implicitly framed as educated, modern, and liberated, it's a savior complex.
It completely erased the complex, contextually specific realities, agency, and activism of women's lives in diverse non-Western societies. Mohanty wasn't arguing against feminism. She was arguing against a specific form of analysis that basically reproduced colonial power dynamics, just dressed up in feminist theory.
Let's look at how this plays out in specific local contexts, because you cannot cut and paste liberation. For example, Islamic feminist thought. Western feminism is often aggressively secular and views organized religion strictly as an instrument of patriarchy.
True.
But Islamic feminism wrestles deeply with the relationship between feminist principles and religious practice. They engage in ijtihad, the critical reinterpretation of sacred texts, to find gender egalitarianism within the Quran itself. That is a completely different starting point than secular Western feminism.
Or consider African feminism, which frequently critiques the Western movement's hyper-focus on radical individualism. Many African feminist frameworks explore how feminist values can be compatible with or integrated into traditional, communal, and family structures, rather than viewing the community strictly as an oppressive force to be escaped.
And Indian feminist politics, particularly Dalit feminism, which has to navigate the incredibly complex, rigid dimensions of the caste system. A Western analysis based strictly on gender and capitalism is completely unequipped to address the specific compounded oppression of a woman at the bottom of the caste hierarchy.
It demonstrates that while the feminist project is genuinely global in its aspirations, its application must necessarily be hyperlocal.
And there's a fascinating, almost inescapable irony embedded in all of this global discourse. Even as global feminism diversifies and decentralizes, the dominant language used to conduct this international academic discourse remains English.
Which transitions us to the final major mechanism of change we need to discuss: feminism and language. The fact that English dominates the global conversation is fitting in a way, because feminism hasn't just used the English language to argue its points. It has fundamentally rewired the language itself.
I find this absolutely mind-blowing because, again, it goes back to things we assume are just natural. We speak everyday English without even thinking about the massive, deliberate modification of words that took place in the 1970s and 80s.
Oh, it was a massive
A
project.
feminist language reform was a highly contested, intentional project to remove gendered assumptions from the very syllables we speak.
The goal was to make women visible in language where they had been erased, and to remove language that automatically subordinated them.
Take the invention of the title "imsense." It seems so mundane to us now. But before the 1970s, men were just Mr., regardless of whether they were married or single. Their marital status was not considered their defining public feature, but women had to be Miss or Mrs. You had to formally disclose your sexual and legal relationship to a man every single time you filled out a bank form, applied for a job, or introduced yourself. Ms. Roops was resurrected and deliberately popularized to parallel Mr., allowing women to exist in public space without defining themselves by their marital status.
We see this same structural shift in the move away from occupational titles that assume male defaults, the push to change stewardess to flight attendant or policeman to police officer. We see it in the shift away from using he as the generic pronoun for any unknown person, which has culminated in the widespread mainstream acceptance of the singular they in formal English today.
But it's not just about tweaking existing grammar. It's about the profound act of inventing entirely new words to name the previously unnamed.
Think about terms like sexual harassment, date rape, the glass ceiling, or toxic masculinity. The behaviors and phenomena described by these words existed for centuries before the words did.
Of course.
But without the vocabulary, they were just individual, isolated experiences of discomfort, failure, or injustice.
When the term sexual harassment was coined by activists at Cornell University in 1975, they didn't invent the behavior of a boss demanding sexual favors from an employee, but they invented the conceptual container for it. So what does this actually mean on a cognitive level?
Well, this connects directly to a concept in linguistics called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis.
Okay, what's that?
The philosophical idea is that the language you speak shapes the way you were able to think. While the strictest version of that hypothesis is debated by linguists, what is absolutely uncontested is the interaction between language and legal concepts. New concepts require new vocabulary to be shared. And conversely, having that new vocabulary makes those concepts widely accessible to the public mind.
So what does this all mean? You literally cannot fix a societal problem if you don't possess the words to collectively describe it. When feminists gave society the term sexual harassment, they made it visible. And once it was visible, they could legislate against it. The words are the tools that build the new architecture.
The feminist contribution to the English vocabulary is perhaps the most accurate, everyday measure of the invisible, conceptual work the movement has accomplished over the last 2 centuries.
Which brings us full circle. We have traced an incredible, turbulent journey today. We started with the first wave's fight for the vote, rooted in Enlightenment philosophy, culminating in women breaking windows, enduring force-feeding, and exposing the blind spots of race.
Yeah.
We moved into the living rooms of the second wave, realizing the personal is political, dismantling the feminine mystique, and changing the laws of bodily autonomy. We rode the third wave's intersectional legal theories and cultural punk rock remix right into the digital amplification and fierce accountability of the fourth wave. And we've seen how it ripples out globally, clashing with colonial assumptions, and ultimately alters the very grammar we speak.
It is a remarkable trajectory. A family of movements constantly arguing with itself, constantly evolving, and constantly expanding the definition of what equality means in practice.
And so, to you, the listener, think back to that morning routine we talked about at the very beginning. Regardless of your own background, your gender, or your politics, the very institutional structure of the society you woke up in today, the laws that govern your workplace, the structure of your bank account, the language you use to describe your reality, was built by the friction of the debates we just unpacked.
Which leaves us with a final, vital question to consider. The waves of history do not stop. They are in motion right now.
Right.
If a fifth wave of feminism were to begin tomorrow, perhaps driven by the unique algorithmic biases of artificial intelligence, the uncharted social territories of virtual realities, or breakthroughs in reproductive biotechnology, what are the invisible inequalities of our present day that this new wave will need to name, untangle, and dismantle?
What is the new normal that we haven't even realized is actually a cage? Something for you to mull over the next time you assume the floor beneath your feet is just a natural given. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the structures around you.